Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we've got a fantastic and very creative and lively conversation ready for you with Jeff Goldsmith. Now, Jeff, you are a fractional CMO. You are a coach to CEOs, CMOs. You've worked with a lot of different agencies, a lot of different brands, but your background is very varied, from starting on AI and robotics to copywriter in Japan, writing for Wired magazine. If you could tell us a little bit more about your background before we get into the subject of why creativity still moves the needle and why we've lost a lot of that in today's B2B marketing.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Well, I grew up in Woodstock, New York, which is a pretty creative community. And I moved to New York City and ended up working for a friend's dad in a commercial production company and then in advertising. I left New York and I traveled the world. I lived in Mexico, Japan, and France, and studied languages and read literature. It's a pretty unusual background. During that time, I got my first job in Japan as a copywriter. When I came back to New York, I interviewed Allen Ginsberg for Details magazine. And then that started a little journalism career. And I ended up writing for Wired back in the beginning in the 90s. And I wrote a piece called This Is Your Brain on Tetris, which became very well known, still quoted. I coined some stuff in that article. And then I happened to meet the Tetris guys. I met Alexei Pajitnov and his partner and came to San Francisco to work with them. And then I started working for digital agencies and startups starting in the 90s. As you said, I did work on some big brands. Eventually, it culminated in working for this branding firm called Wolf Olins, which is very great agency. Then after that, I started working directly for startups. I had worked for some a little bit in the 90s. And then in the middle of the 2000s, about 20 years ago now, I really started taking it seriously. That's when I started bringing all that advertising and journalism background into sort of the enterprise, into technology businesses. In the beginning, I didn't know everything I needed to know to be head of marketing, but eventually I did learn all that and gain those skills, took it really seriously. And here I am.
So I know one of your biggest passions is to help coach marketing inside from scale ups to larger organizations, and that you actually do a lot of that. You've coined a phrase that is, I don't know if it defines how you coach, but it defines a bit about this, why creativity still moves the needle. And you call it aesthetic engineering. If you could kind of define that for us here, and then relate that into kind of how you coach and work with your clients and businesses.
Yeah. Well, full disclosure, Steve and I coined this like 15 minutes ago, but before this podcast comes out, I'll write something about it on LinkedIn. Well, engineers are trained to math with components. My partner is an electrical engineer and also an artist. She did the art behind me. So she was an electrical engineer. She studied components and physics and math and all that business. Similarly, people can be trained in design and typography, in what makes a good headline, right? A headline communicates a benefit. One of my boss in Japan used to shout at me, "What's the benefit?" And he drilled that into my head. So I've been trained in sort of the aesthetics of marketing. And everyone's creative, but some people come to the table with more kind of, they understand the principles of aesthetics. So I thought aesthetic engineering kind of helps clarify what it is that we mean by creativity. Because when an analyst at IDC said to me, one of the biggest barriers for small startups to get traction is trust. Now, if a startup has a website that's really well designed, well, the text is aligned, the form looks really good, it's not too bloated with fields, and the headline is clear, there isn't too much copy for someone to read, there's a little quick video that shows what the company does, someone will convert, someone will fill out a form and click submit. But if the site is not dialed in that way, there's going to be less conversions. For every 1,000 people that come to the site, how many people are going to fill out that form? The aesthetic engineering of the site will dictate that. That's just one example. There's one-pagers, there's PowerPoints, there's et cetera, et cetera. The aesthetic engineering of an investor deck that really clarifies the market, how you're going to conquer that market, what the differentiator is, who your competitors are. Having that be clear and well designed is going to help an investor take this around to his team and say, what do you think? They're all going to be more interested in it if it's aesthetically engineered. You know what I mean?
So one of the big things that I take away from this too is that there's a lot of left brain and right brain thinking that goes into marketing. I interview C-suite executives from B2B companies every day on this podcast. And there's a lot that are very proud of the fact that I started in engineering. I started actually as an investment banker. I started as an accountant, and we need that side of the brain to go through the right thinking processes and really give it its due. What has been lost, though, is in a lot of ways the fact that just the message, the delivery, the aesthetics, back to the Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. We have to think about that.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring up years ago, and then I want you to remember in our previous conversation some of the headlines that you wrote. It was a blueprint of a company. So I'm going to have you talk about that in a second, because I think we should tell some stories here about and give examples of how creativity really does help move the needle.
Yep.
Like I was involved when the Mazda Miata was originally introduced to the United States.
Wow.
I was the director of strategic planning. So very not the most creative. We introduced the Miata. I think it was 2 years later, BMW came out with the Z3, and our creative department came with a headline, and it was literally just a gorgeous shot of the Mazda Miata profile shot with a simple headline. There was nothing else. Beware of expensive imitations.
It's a great headline.
Right.
Because, as my boss in Japan used to say, what's the benefit? There's the benefit. Less expensive, and don't get fooled by the competitor.
It's got the competitive positioning, it's got the aspirations, the motivations, the emotions behind it. I remember the general manager of Mazda in Americas looked at it and he says, how many places can you put that? That's one example of how creativity really moves the needle. You hear a headline like that, you're like, oh, okay, this kind of says it all. This does it all. You had an example of that as well.
I'll tell you that story in a second. So I'm sure the general manager of Mazda wanted to drive revenue. He wanted to sell cars. And so that's something that I find that CMOs also lose sight of, is that they're struggling to do marketing. They may have good creative ideas, but if you swing too far in that direction into creativity for its own sake, you won't serve revenue. And so beware of expensive imitators helps serve the revenue goal and does the job of being a catchy headline, right?
We had the biggest competitor come into the marketplace that there was no other roadster at the time. If you wanted a roadster, like the old feeling of the road and the speed and the, low and the wind going into your hair, and there wasn't any other competitor. So it was the very first time we had competition. So it absolutely was very strategically laid out, but very creatively executed, that added that fuel to it.
And that headline does something that I love, which is it takes a cliche and it tweaks it slightly. So it's familiar, but new. Like this idea of aesthetic engineering, it sounds familiar, but it's probably a new idea. So new ideas can kind of move the needle, right? Because it's an end run around what everyone's already thinking. So I told you this story about how I got my first job as a copywriter in Japan. I got into this agency because I called every ad agency in Tokyo looking for a job. And I talked to Mr. Nakamura and he would say, no, we don't need a copywriter. I'd say, well, who else can I call? So he would say, well, why don't you call Mr. Iwamura at such and such agency? So I'd call Mr. Iwamura and say, oh, did I say Hashimoto? He told me to call you. And so I had this phone tree of every ad agency in Tokyo and I found an opening. So I went into this agency and I said, I'm a copywriter. I had taken copywriting classes at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And one of my teachers had written the line, Visine gets the red out. And he told me, we walked to the subway together at the class. He said, I just blurted that line out in a meeting. And I learned you can just say it. And then everyone's like, oh my, that's it. So I went to this agency and they said, well, how do we judge you? You don't have a portfolio. Because I was like a young traveler. And I said, well, give me a product to work on an ad for, and I'll come back on Monday. So they said, all right, here's this electronic drafting robot. You drop it on a piece of paper and it'll draw a blueprint. And this was in the 80s. So I came back on Monday and I said, okay, I've got this ad for you. And they're like, well, where is it? I'm like, well, I can just tell it to you. And they looked so dubious. Okay, the robot's on your blueprint, and here's a blueprint of the Colosseum in Rome. And here's your headline: Plan Rome in a Day. And they looked at each other and said, we'll be right back. So they came back in 5 minutes and offered me a job. When that happened, I realized, oh, I can just do that whenever I want to get a job at an ad agency. In fact, 15 years later, perhaps, when I'd come to San Francisco and digital advertising was beginning to blossom, I heard about an opening at Modem Media. And I wrote to them and said, well, have you done any digital advertising before? I'm like, nobody's done any digital advertising before. But I wrote some banner ideas and they gave me a job. Same process. So ever since then, I realized I've got this headline gene inherited from someone in my past so that I'm able to just crank out these headlines pretty easily. And with the advent of digital, I used to do these workshops at accelerators in San Francisco where I'd ask the audience, okay, tell me the tagline for your company. I'd show them like an Optimizely test where it showed, okay, this headline got this kind of conversion rate. People would click on the ad and go to the website, and how many of them converted. And the best performing line was 5x better than the worst performing line. Now, that means your leads are costing you 20% of what they would have if you just tested your first presumption. This is also part of aesthetic engineering, right? How do you drive down the cost of customer acquisition so that your model works? So I used to do these stand-up brainstorming sessions with groups of people. That culminated, I did one at Linux Tag in Berlin, 300 people in the audience. And I was just doing headlines on stage. And people were saying, that's a great idea. And it's like, I've heard that's a great idea somewhere between 1,000 and 20,000 times. I hear it all the time. I went to an event last night. I met this young guy and I gave him a business idea. It's like these guys were talking about fundraising with communities for film. I'm like, you see if this I gave him a domain name, see if that's available. You could start building that. And one of the guys who was a speaker was one of the early Facebook lawyers who's the head of privacy. I said, just talk to that guy. You'll figure out how do you have a user agreement so you can take the money and not have to return it and pool the money and give it to the best idea. And boom, you're off to the races. He's like, that's a great idea.
See, that's the thing. Creative ideas can come in the form of a headline. Yeah. Creative ideas can come in the form of an event, can come in the form of a good case study. So we tend to try to figure out, here's our playbook. This is what we do. Mm-hmm. And as soon as we stop thinking about what we can do and just what we're supposed to do, to me, that's where lots of creativity just stops. We want it to be easy. We want to just say, here's the ABCD of what we do. But as soon as we do that, then all of a sudden, we're no longer trying to think outside of the box. We're no longer trying to come up with new ways to approach this market, new ways to understand our ICP, new headlines to test. So the idea of aesthetic engineering is about design and look at it. I want to look at the problem, the challenge that a company has, and come at it with fresh eyes.
Right, right. That is a challenge. And you're right. It's not just about a headline. It's not just about design. It's about what's the subject of a webinar that will attract the most people that are part of your ICP? What's the subject? What do they care about? And then how do you promote that on LinkedIn? What are the actual tactics? I have my own playbook right now, but that playbook for attracting audiences to webinars always has to change, because once everybody learns about those tactics, then it becomes just too noisy to break through. Right. But when you can discover these, what I like to call end runs, when it's like, oh man, he just did a 70-yard touchdown. But when you have an end run possibility around IBM and Adobe, Figma had an end run around Adobe. Like, we have a browser-based creative suite that is not expensive. And that was a total end run around Adobe. The product market fit was perfect. And So Adobe tried to acquire them for $20 billion. But anyway, the merger got blocked. But that was an amazing end run.
But this idea of being creative in every aspect of the go-to-market plan. Let me give you an example. I meet so many people on this podcast. So this woman, her name's Carol Carpenter. She went back to a CMO. I think she's a CEO now. She said, Steve, sometimes you just have to get people to think differently and to know that they're valued. And that if you do that with your employees, what they pour into the business, and then therefore what your clients feel and how you impact them, and then grow your own business. So she said, one of the first things I did as a CEO is we had an executive parking area, and it was fenced, had chain link fence around it. That's where the executives went and parked. She said, I went and had a bulldozer, brought it in during the middle of the day where it would make tons of dust and noise. And we just bulldozed down that fence, and anybody could park there, right? It was just making a massive statement in a very creative way that there isn't this division between us and you. Great ideas come from everywhere. Everybody is a contributor here, right? And so she just made a big creative statement to reset the culture in the entire company. That's the idea of creativity, and not just in marketing. Creativity in any department, anywhere in the business, right? If it's lauded, inspired, it will happen. And we just lose the impetus in that. So I don't know if that has anything to do with aesthetic engineering, but I'm trying to make it.
Team dynamics are very important and can be shifted. I even think bulldozing a fence, asking every employee in the company to make a video about the product, about why do you work at X company. There's a lot of ideas to help the team feel cohesion and ownership and participation in the enterprise. And bulldozing a fence, if the CEO feels that having this hierarchy is a bad idea, bulldoze the fence. You know what I mean? Don't flaunt the executive perks. Make everything transparent. Take ideas from everywhere. And you suddenly have a flatter, more egalitarian organization. If that's the stage the company is at, those are all creative ideas to make that happen. I'm not an expert in internal branding, but that's the term they use. It's an important role. Allowing people to communicate better with each other becomes a driver of greater cohesion and clearer agreements between people and less politics. So there's a lot of creative ways around these business problems, and thinking outside the box around that is very important.
You coach CMOs, you work alongside CMOs, CEOs. What's your advice when you come in and your perspective is like, I'm going to help? How do you help? What do you do? How do you help them focus?
Well, we'll start broad and then we'll narrow down. An early boss of mine said to me, try everything. There's zero prioritization in that call to arms. But it's true. Over time, you do have to try everything. You keep trying things until you break through and find that end run. You get that article in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, or you figure out that headline in a Google ad and then on a landing page that gets a high conversion rate. And all of those people who sign up end up getting on the calls, and you close 20% of the deals or whatever your goal is. So you have to try a lot of things to make those sorts of things work, the press, the conversion, and so forth. But you need to focus, you need to look at your funnel and try to figure out where the problems are, or maybe the things you haven't done yet that you should have. Have you done a big webinar? Have you done a sponsored webinar where you've paid an organization to send an email blast to their 100,000 followers to try to get a 1,000-person plus webinar? Maybe that'll cost you $10,000, $20,000, but it's worth it if you've never done it, because it's a very validating thing to have this known organization send out that email blast and get those people to come. And then there's awareness amongst those 100,000 people of your company. So if you haven't taken that bet yet and placed that chip on the roulette wheel, you need to do it. It's sort of like a must-do activity. So this is the try everything. But you look at your funnels and you say, okay, here's one that we're not doing. So let's start building that. Like, we look at your funnels and figure out what's not being done. We can also look at your existing funnels and see what's not working. I have a few clients, but my main one right now is a company called Emtrain. And one of the first things I did was I looked at their website and figured out how to increase conversions on the website. So that overall, I think the conversions a little bit more than doubled after we did these experiments. And I really don't want to talk about what we did exactly, but we increased conversions on the website significantly. And so that all of our other marketing efforts had all the cost of conversion was like halved, because you suddenly are getting more conversions on your website. So all the traffic you're driving is more profitable. And that's a big priority, is like looking at your messaging and trying to figure out, okay, is this really working? How long have you said this? Is this confusing, or does this really make sense? Let's try something else. And so you ABC test these things. Within weeks, you see the difference. And so that's very granular. We've gone from try everything to try one thing. So look at your funnels and figure out a few things, a few experiments to run to try to make things better. But then also look for gaps. The sponsored webinar. How do we get in the Wall Street Journal? Crazy goal, right? Comp Science, my last full-time role, we got in the Wall Street Journal, we got in Fox News. When we launched the insurance product, I got both Swiss Re and Nationwide to give us quotes for a press release. That was pretty risky, because either of them could say, this is too much risk for us. We don't want to be in the press. And then it would have blown up all that work. But I gave it, I was like, this is going to take 6 weeks to get them to agree to this. We kept going back and forth and making changes. And I was like, no problem. Let me send it to Nationwide. No problem. Let me send it to Swiss Re. And eventually, okay, everyone's okay with this. Here's the date. And we got in all of insurance media, because we had Comp Science with Nationwide with Swiss Re. And because of the power of that, communications folks at Swiss Re and Nationwide were helping us as well, along with my PR person. We were in every insurance publication. It was awesome. And that really put Comp Science on the map. Then eventually that led to, legitimizing us so that the Wall Street Journal could do something, and then Fox News could do something. But without that fundamental industry buy-in, validation, you don't get in the Wall Street Journal and on Fox News. So there's these steps. So you look at these funnels and you're like, okay, where are we at with prep? You've written a blog post? Fantastic. Let's see if we can get someone else to write a blog post about you. Getting in media is very validating. And if you haven't done it yet, that's one of the funnels that is not operating for you.
You used the word a few minutes ago, experiment. I did another podcast with a woman, and she said, I have 10% of my budget allocated for experimenting, things that we haven't done.
Yeah.
Who has money allocated for literally things they don't even know what they're going to do yet? Right? Who's going to go into their CFO's office and go, I'm going to put 10% of this budget to stuff that I can't even tell you what it is, because I don't even know what it is yet. We're just going to be doing some experimenting, right? But if we stop trying, we stop iterating, we stop using that creative part of our brain, then we're sticking to the same old playbook. Even though, guess what, over the last 10, 15 years, we have massive indications we cannot do that. Right? Our buying committee is 3 to 4 times the size that it used to be. The amount of competitors that we have is 3 to 4 times the size that we used to have. Right? Those same buyers that wanted to talk to us before are now on that self-service buyer's journey. They didn't want to talk to us till the very, very end. Like, things are changing around us.
Yep.
And if we're not changing with those and experimenting and being creative, to your point, we're going to be left behind.
Yeah, Figma will come and crush you.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, we could go on for a long time because this is fun. But if there was, in 30 seconds, one thing that you wanted people to take away from this podcast, what would it be?
Well, don't believe anything you think, and experiment with new copy for your Google ads and new strategies, acquire customers and generate awareness in the market. You talked about the buyer committee getting bigger. They say it takes, like, some people say 5, some people say 20 impressions to make someone remember you and consider your product or service. How are you going to get the word out there? You need to experiment. And you think these are the way things are. as you say, things are constantly changing. So you have to keep trying new things, try everything.
All right. Well, if people had questions for you after this, would it be appropriate that we gave out maybe a link to your LinkedIn profile?
Yeah, I'm happy to have calls with anybody and do a, introductory little brainstorming session with anyone. Actually, I wrote a book called This Book Can Make You Famous. And I just contracted with somebody to read the audiobook. And that's going to come out soon. I actually have an offer, introduction to the audiobook. This audiobook can make you famous, which is essentially, I'll do a half an hour brainstorming session with you about how to become famous if you agree to let me publish that on TikTok.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much. All just the ideas, the creativity that we've been talking about, it's refreshing. It's invigorating. I just appreciate you coming on and spending time with us on the podcast.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate the opportunity. Nice talking to you.